Hello, and welcome to episode 2 of Tim the Composer's podcast. I'm Tim, and I'm a composer. Perhaps you've listened to episode 1 about Beethoven's First Symphony, and perhaps you've even listened to episode 0, in which I describe what this podcast is all about. Well, in the last episode about Beethoven, I mentioned that Beethoven, when he was a young boy, about the age of 11, he was able to play the whole of Bach's well-tempered Clavier. I didn't really explain much about what Bach's well-tempered Clavier is, so I thought I'd dive into that in this, our second episode. This also provides a great way to explain a bit more about how music works, what we mean by keys, and that's in the sense of, the instrument, the piano, but really, importantly, in a sort of how music works sense. You'll often hear pieces of music listed as being in C major or D minor. So C major and D minor are keys, and I'm going to explain what they are. If you're a musician and you know perfectly well what they are, bear with me, perhaps there'll be something new you'll find out in this. So here goes. The well-tempered Clavier, it's a piece of music by Bach. Now I'm going to cover what the well-tempered bit means, what the Clavier bit means. So well-tempered, that refers to the keys in the how music works sense, and the Clavier bit refers to keys as in an instrument sense. Also going to look a bit into Bach, what was going on in his life at the time he was writing this music. So the well-tempered Clavier is actually a pair of books. Each book contains a set of pieces, 48 pieces in total in each book, and they come in 24 pairs. Each pair is in a different major or minor key, and therefore each book covers every major and minor key. So he does that twice. He writes a pair of pieces of music in every single major and minor key in each of these books. Got that? So each book goes through the whole cycle. Now in this episode of the podcast, we're going to look at the first book only, which was completed in 1722, when Bach lived in a town called Curtin. The second book appears 20 years later in 1742. Bach, his situation in life had changed quite considerably by that point, and he was living in Leipzig. So the first book is the work of a man in his 20s and 30s, whereas the second book, he's in his late 50s. So really different parts of his life there. Now Bach is absolutely a fascinating composer to me. So here's a few little things about his life. Bach, or J.S. Bach, or Johann Sebastian Bach to give him his full name, but we can just call him Bach for short. He's that famous. And he in the course of his life, he hardly travelled very far from his birthplace. He was born in the same year, 1685, as Handel, the very famous composer, and they were only born around 80 miles apart, yet they never met in their entire life. Bach once made a journey in 1719, when he was in his early 30s, to go and meet Handel. There's a journey of about 22 miles from Curtin to Halle. He was hoping to meet Handel there. Quite possibly he walked the whole way, but Handel had already left town by the time Bach got there, so they never met. Unlike Bach, Handel actually travelled widely in his life. He went to live in Rome before moving to London, where he became enormously successful and enormously wealthy. In fact, Handel was one of the wealthiest composers of all prior to the 20th century. I'm going to talk about Handel, no doubt, in a future podcast, but this is a podcast about Bach. So Bach never rose to anything like the fame or wealth of Handel in his lifetime. And until his music was revived and rediscovered, I suppose, in the 19th century, wasn't really played very much at all after he died, and he wasn't really recognised until the 19th century as the genius that we know him as today. He comes across in his music as being perhaps very conservative in his musical tastes and the forms of music that he uses, and yet it's incredibly sophisticated music in the range of what he set out to do. It wasn't always about creating a beautiful thing, something like that. In fact, quite the opposite sometimes. Now, he had hardly any sort of musical resources at his disposal. He didn't have orchestras. He didn't have huge numbers of professional musicians. You look at some of the other composers. Handel, for example. So Handel had his own opera company. He put on all sorts of huge shows. Bach, he did work as a musician throughout his life, but he didn't have huge numbers of professional musicians, singers, instrumentalists at his disposal, especially considering the ambition of what Bach writes. He was constantly, throughout his life, looking for a better position where he could perhaps have access to those things, different bigger venues, bigger ensembles of musicians, more chances, but he had lots of setbacks in his life. He was turned down for lots of positions. He kept applying for jobs and was constantly rebuffed. And yet, he lived at a time where one of the biggest innovations in music had taken hold, what we call the tonal system, and I talked a bit about that in the previous episode. He also, through the jobs that he did have, he had the time and the opportunity to explore music without really much fear of consequence for straying or being particularly radical. He also had the most brilliant mind. He was a total genius. And you put those ingredients together and you get something unique, something extraordinary. He was doing things within and with the tonal system which nobody else at the time or before had done or perhaps even thought to do. You could say that perhaps even since, nobody's repeated the sort of heights of musical work that Bach has achieved. Much of his music, however, as I said, was forgotten until it was revived or rediscovered in the 19th century when people started to investigate who was this sort of legendary mythical Bach who lived 100 years ago. Who was that? And people started to revive his music. In the 19th century, there was a desire to build an idea of a classical music where there were classics, where there were great works that had existed in the past and great composers that had existed in the past. So music was becoming a bit of an institution. So Bach was a very convenient composer to identify as having been one of these original greats. There was also an increasing identification of nationalism with music, including in particular German nationalism. Germany as a distinct nation state rather than a collection of duchies within the Holy Roman Empire. Now, nationalism needs heroes and a cultural guiding spirit, and Bach, well, he was ideal for that. He was very much from the territory of Germany rather than, for example, Austria. Now, there is a lot of music to explore in Bach, probably more than a lifetime's worth just in one composer. Some of it is deeply, deeply weird, hard to comprehend from our point in history, and I'm sure we'll explore Bach again in future podcasts. But this podcast, we're going to explore this one key work, one that was never really forgotten, didn't have to be rediscovered in the way that some of his much bigger works were, for example, the St. Matthew Passion. And indeed, this piece, the Well-Tempered Clavier, was the bread and butter of talented pianists such as Beethoven, well before the Bach revival happened in the 19th century. Right then, who was Bach? Then, at the time, he was creating the first book of the Well-Tempered Clavier, which took him a fair number of years. It wasn't all just written in one go. So we know relatively little of his earliest life when he was a child. He was born in Eisenach, which is in Germany, and was then the capital of the Duchy of Saxe-Eisenach. If you look at a map of modern Germany, Eisenach is pretty much directly right smack bang in the centre of it. It's about 100 miles north of Frankfurt. He was the 8th and youngest child of Johann Ambrosius Bach, who was the director of the town music in Eisenach. His mother was Maria Elisabeth, who was the daughter of a town councillor in Eisenach. So, respectable middle-class family, I suppose. His wider family included many, many musicians, organists, court chamber musicians, other composers. He learned the violin and he learned the organ. His mother died in 1694 and his father 8 months later. So both before Bach, Johann Sebastian Bach, both before he was 10 years old. So he was an orphan. His eldest brother, Johann Christoph, raised him, took him into his home. He was the organist at St. Michael's Church in Ohrdruf. I apologise to all of the Germans who might be listening. I'm not good at German, and I'm probably mispronouncing the names of the wonderful towns in Germany. But anyway, Johann Christoph was the organist at St. Michael's Church in Ohrdruf, not far, really 25 miles away from Eisenach. In 1700, Johann Sebastian Bach went to school in Lüneburg, 2 weeks' travel on foot north of Ohrdruf. He went there with his friend Georg Erdmann, and so he was able to develop his interest in music further there, singing in the choir and playing organ and violin. So at this point, when he's going to school with his friend Georg Erdmann, he's about 15. After finishing at that school, so I guess he's about 18 at this point, he tried to get an organist job at Sangerhausen, another town in this region, but he was turned down. Eventually, he did get a job as a court musician, so not an organist, for Duke Johann Ernst III in Weimar, which sounds grand, but actually it was quite likely to be a pretty menial job not involving very much actual music. Nonetheless, he played keyboard, in particular he played the organ, so well and gained such a reputation as a brilliant player that he was able to get a better job at the new church in Arnstadt as the organist. So this came with some pretty light duties and a reasonable salary. Crucially, the new organ in that church in Arnstadt was tuned in a specific way that allowed music to be played in a wider variety of keys than usual. I'm going to come back to that point because that might sound a strange thing to say, that an instrument could be tuned to allow it to play in multiple keys. Well, we're going to come back to that. So it was during this time, when he's living in Arnstadt, that Johann Sebastian Bach, and he was about 20 by now, he went to go and hear a famous organist, Dietrich Buxtehude, and to take lessons from another organist and composer, Johann Adam Reinken, now both of them in the city of Lübeck. Okay, so in the city of Lübeck, Bach is currently in Arnstadt. That's 280 miles away, and Bach did the whole thing on foot. You can put the journey into Google Maps. If you say, I want to travel on foot from Arnstadt to Lübeck, and it says it reckons about 87 hours to walk. I'm sure you wouldn't do that non-stop though. Now, he'd only been given leave to be away from his job for 4 weeks, but this whole journey, 280 miles there, 280 miles back, plus some time spent with studying with Reinken and listening to Buxtehude play, the whole journey took about 4 months, so he got into quite a lot of trouble with his employer, the Duke, as you might imagine. Soon after, Bach applied for and got another job, this time again as organist at the Blasius Church in Mulhausen. Again, another town in the same region, about 15 miles north of his birthplace in Eisenach. He's now about 21, 22, so he's been through several jobs, this time again for slightly better pay, slightly better conditions, and a better choir at the church. He even persuaded the church and the town government to fund an expensive renovation of the church organ. So around this time, he married Maria Barbara and had his first child, who was a daughter, Katharina. But this job in Mulhausen was only for a short period of time, just about a year, and then he returned to Weimar, this time for 9 years. And this time, he began to work on the piece of music called the Well-Tempered Clavier. Right, so he's living back in Weimar. He's now the organist at the Duke's court, and from 1714 he was the director of music. He and his wife lived at a house near the Duke's palace, and he had 3 more children, sons, Wilhelm, Karl, and another Johann. In fact, they had 3 further children around this time, including twins, but none survived past their first birthday. Now, Bach fell out with the authorities, with the Duke. He spent a month in prison, would you believe? And was then dismissed dishonorably from his job in 1717. He was put in prison for trying to get a new job. They would do that to people in those days. And apparently he was quite pushy about his desire to leave. So the Duke, Wilhelm Ernst, eventually dismissed him with a dishonorable discharge after this spell in prison to teach him a lesson. But during his time inside, he was able to write music, including some of the Well-Tempered Clavier, Book 1. Happily, Bach was able to move to his new job, this time in Curtin, in 1717, 100 miles away to the northeast, about 40 miles north of the city of Leipzig. Here, he worked as director of music, or Kapellmeister, for Prince Leopold of Anhalt-Curtin. And during this time, he stayed there for about 6 years. He completed the Well-Tempered Clavier, which he had started just before, and while he then went on to an even more illustrious career working in Leipzig, this is where we're going to stop the story of his life. But Bach's Leipzig years, absolutely terrific stuff. So he was 32 when he arrived at Curtin and about 38 when he left. And that was only about a year or so after completing Well-Tempered Clavier. In 1720, suddenly, while Bach was away from home working for Prince Leopold, his wife very suddenly and unexpectedly died, Maria Barbara. We don't know the cause. It was not documented what the cause was, but it was sudden and it was unexpected. He remarried in 1721 to a woman called Anna Magdalena. She was a soprano who also worked at the court in Curtin. Now, together, they had a further 13 children, of whom 6 survived into adulthood, who were Gottfried, Elizabeth, 2 more Johanns, who went on to become very famous musicians, Johanna and Regina. Now, this number of children, I mentioned before that he had had 4 children with Maria Barbara, including 3 who didn't survive, and he's had 13 with Anna Magdalena, of whom 6 survived. Now, that number of children in total seems to us extraordinary and unimaginable, and to lose that many, but it was actually not uncommon at the time. Around a third of children at this time didn't survive to their 5th birthday, and only around half survived to adulthood. Therefore, of the 20 children Johann Sebastian Bach had, 10 surviving to adulthood, which is what happened, is expected, is normal for the time, which seems totally extraordinary to us. This mortality rate was particularly due to epidemics of smallpox, which is a really severe problem at the time, measles, and other illnesses, dysentery, malnutrition, poor sanitation, especially in the larger towns. The Bach's family actually were quite fortunate to live until they moved to Leipzig, which was a very big town. They lived in towns which were big enough to have doctors, reliable food sources, that kind of thing, but not so big that they suffered from the squalor and terrible conditions in the biggest cities. And of course, as he had a small but regular income, the family were not living in poverty. Now, while it was therefore not unusual to lose 10 out of 20 of your children before they reach adulthood, it must surely have been deeply tragic for Bach's family and in general for the people living at the time. What is unusual, though, is the number of children, the sheer number of children, 20. At that time, it was quite normal for families to be big by our standards in the modern day, to have 5 or 6 children. That was perfectly normal. Bach's second wife was young when they married. She was 20, he was 36, and she had her 13 children over the next 21 years, the last at the age of 41, which was as sort of quite unusual then as it is now. Now, while I think we find it very hard to relate to the circumstances of Bach and his children, and even other things in Bach's life, like walking for 280 miles and then back again, I think we can all relate to having good and bad employers, trying to find a better job, marrying, having children at all, that sort of thing. So there are some things in Bach's life I think we can immediately relate to. Right, returning to the Well-Tempered Clavier now. That has a subtitle, or a few extra words on the front page. It says, "For the profit and use of musical youth desirous of learning, and especially for the pastime of those already skilled in this study." So it's a book written for keyboard players who had already learnt a bit about how to play the instrument to get better. But I think it's so much more than that. It's sort of a series of snapshots of things that happened in Bach's life, I like to think. Which makes it such a much more richer piece of music than really a book just for students, so to speak. Well, we know that this book of music wasn't actually printed until 1801, which is a long time after Bach died in about 1750. But handwritten copies circulated widely, so people would copy it out and share it that way, by hand. So when the young Beethoven played his copy of Well-Tempered Clavier, it would have been one of these ones that had been copied out and shared from musician to musician. So Bach assembled this book of pieces over several years, perhaps around about 10 years, in the early part of his professional life, where he's changing job fairly frequently. He's starting to have his family, he's starting to really put together his career. And I think it's interesting that he set himself this challenge and worked at it over all of that particular period in his life, this 10 years. He completed many other pieces of music during this time, but this sort of side project was something he worked on and chipped away at throughout. So we're going to explore this work and understand a bit better about this system of keys, how that's so important to this piece of music. But we're also going to explore the range of characters, of landscapes, of images that Bach conjures up in this extraordinary collection of music. But let's understand this title a bit first. Well-Tempered Clavier. The easy bit of that, I think, is clavier. So clavier, it refers to a keyboard. It means keyboard, but it's not the same as the piano we know today, which had not yet really developed at all into what we know of as the modern piano. The keyboard instruments, i.e. using a mechanical key to produce a sound, well, those have been around for a very long time. There are many keyboard instruments available, perhaps most significantly for Bach, the organ. Bach was known as a virtuoso player of that in his life. Also instruments like the clavecin, the harpsichord, and the clavichord. Bach had several harpsichords and a clavichord in his house. And there were other similar types of instruments, but the modern piano, the modern big piano that we know today, didn't exist in that form at the time. So we can say, conclusively, that the Well-Tempered Clavier was not written for the piano. Right. So what was it written for then? Well, possibly, I like to think, a clavichord. It's quite a small keyboard instrument, rectangular. It's got quite a soft tone, although it can vary. It's quite common in private homes from the early 15th century right the way through to the 19th century. Not very common now, but it's quite an intimate sound. And the person who has the best position to hear what a clavichord sounds like is the person that's playing it, or a person right next to them, or sitting in the same small room. So it's not for a grand concert hall, it's for small rooms, I think, and for perhaps saying something quite personal to the listener. But it could also be played equally on the organ, on the harpsichord, other instruments of the time. It's played today on the piano very often, and it really comes to life on the piano. And there are lots of brilliant recordings to listen to, but it wasn't originally written for that instrument. Right, the well-tempered part. Now this refers to a system of tuning. You may have heard musicians tuning up before they're about to play. Well, there's a system to that, and the well-tempered bit refers to how we tune instruments. What we need to know now is that tuning keyboard instruments in particular was a challenge. All of the notes on a keyboard allow, in theory, any key of music to be played. But due to the way the notes are tuned, and they're not evenly tuned, the gaps in between them in Bach's time are not the same. That means not every key of music sounds nice. If you tune it so it sounds great in one key, it will send all of the other keys out. So you have to make some compromises if you want to play in more than one key. The main innovation in the well-tempered clavier depends on this idea that all keys, all scales can be played, all of them, if the instrument is tuned correctly. And you don't have to retune the instrument to play some of those more distant, more remote keys. We know that Bach liked to play with the tuning of his own harpsichords and clavichords. And there's been a lot of argument over the years about exactly how he did this, what exactly was the tuning system he came up with that allowed him to play in any key at all. But nonetheless, we know that he did manage to do that. It's also quite clear that he didn't use an equal spacing between every note. That's what we do today, and it has a number of implications for what music sounds like. But he didn't use the same system that we use today, which is today called equal temperament. So he used something called a well temperament, so it would sound well in every key. We didn't use equal temperament. Right, this might seem completely odd, so I'm going to play a little bit on my piano to demonstrate what all this means in sound, especially if you aren't sure exactly what keys are. So, what are keys? I'm going to play here. This is a chord of C major. So if I was playing a piece of music in using those sort of notes, I'm playing in C major. Now, another key I might play in is F major. And then I might play a piece in G major. They'll sound pretty similar music that I was playing, but they're all in different parts of the piano. So let me play a scale of C major, so you can understand a bit about what a scale is. Now if I play a scale of F major, you can perhaps hear that it sounds like the same thing, but it's just a bit higher. Again, if I play C major, and I'll play G major, it's the same thing, but instead of starting on C, I start on G. Okay, so on my piano, I can play, as I've done quite happily, in C, in G, in F, and there are other keys as well. There's A, B flat, E flat, D flat, F sharp, and they all sound fine. My piano is in tune, everything sounds okay. Now my modern piano here is equally tempered. That's been the case for all keyboard instruments pretty much since around 1920. The idea of equal temperament was known about at Bach's time and for about 100 years before that, but it was considered undesirable. While it might sound in tune to you, it does actually require quite a lot of compromises from being actually in tune. So what you might hear sounds to you as if that's in tune, but it's not. And you'll hear how it's not in a moment. So what is equally tempered? Why do we have to have these different temperaments? This might seem a bit mysterious. It gets into the physics of how a string vibrates, believe it or not, and Pythagoras identified this problem way back in ancient Greece. So if we have a string, imagine a string vibrating, and then we halve the length of the string, so the sound that string might make is, that's the note C. If we halve the length of the string that's able to vibrate, the sound we'll get will be, it goes up from, and that's called an octave. It sounds like the same note, just higher. Okay, so that's if we halve the length of the string. But if we do a third of the length of the string, we get this. That's called a fifth. Now what you can do is, if you keep adding a fifth over the top of that, eventually you should get back to another C, several octaves higher. I'll just demonstrate that on this piano. I'll have to start with a very low C, all the way down there, and I'll add fifths on top of it until I get to this C right at the top of my piano. Just about hear that. Okay, so here we go. There we go, very high note, that's C, all the way from that low C. So I've stacked all the fifths up, and I'm able to get from a low C to a high C through fifths. Now here's the thing, those are not pure fifths. On a modern piano, you have to shrink the size of each of those fifths by an equal amount. That's why it's called equal temperament. Each of the fifths is made smaller by the same amount in order that we can get to a C. Because if you don't, if you have pure fifths, just a third of the length of a string, for each of those fifths, you'll end up not on this the same note. You'll end up on a note which is very slight distance away from that, which is very strange and very frustrating if you're trying to build instruments that are in tune. Now, Pythagoras, yes, the same Pythagoras that you might know from triangles, from maths at school, Pythagoras identified this, and that small difference between the stacked fifths and the stacked octaves is called, for reasons I'm not actually quite sure, but it's called a Pythagorean comma. Don't know why it's called a comma. Maybe a comma means a small gap, something like that. But that small gap has all kinds of implications for other instruments. So it's important to realise, for now, that might seem all quite confusing, but for now it's important to realise that in Bach's time, people tuned their keyboard instruments in order to get as close as possible to being perfectly in tune, for the fifths to be perfectly in tune in the keys that they would use most commonly, at the expense, at the trade-off of having horribly out of tune fifths in seldom used keys. So you can see, if you've set yourself the ambition of writing a set of pieces that goes through every single key, you've got a problem. You've got to be able to tune your keyboard instrument in a way that allows that. I'm going to demonstrate a bit to you what happens if you have an instrument that's tuned in pure fifths. Now, I'm able to do this for you through the magic of technology, but here is what a clavecin sounds like, or actually a clavichord. This is what a clavichord sounds like. Now that's a C major chord. And now this clavichord is tuned in what's called just intonation, which means that in my key of C major here, it's perfectly in tune. This fifth is a pure fifth, and this third, 1, 2, 3, is a perfect third. So here we go. C major chord, G major chord, also perfectly in tune. But if I go and play a D major chord, now D major, this chord of D major includes a note which is not in C major. Oh, you can hear that sounds a bit spicy, a bit out of tune. If I go further away to a key of F sharp major, which contains lots of notes which are not in C major, it'll sound like this. So it sounds really quite badly out of tune. So we need a way to average out perhaps the distance between the notes and to tune it in such a way that we can play in any key. Right, so I'm going to play now, again, through the magic of technology, I'm going to play in a different way of tuning it, which is called mean tone. So in a mean tone, they tune the instrument to make it sound acceptable in a wider range of keys. Well, we'll see what we mean by acceptable. Here's C major again. So again, not so bad. G major, not bad. D major. Ooh, starting to sound a little bit funny. A major. Again, not bad. E major. Again, not bad. B major. Oh, that sounds horrible. What about F sharp major? Again, horrible. So that system doesn't work. So let's try how Bach tuned his clavichord. Here we go. Here's C major again. G major. D major. A major. E major. So far so good. Now B major, this is went horribly wrong before. Ooh, that sounds okay. What about F sharp major? Bit of a test, this one. That sounds good as well. What about if we go through some other keys? D flat major, for example. Sounds good. A flat major. Sounds good. And we've gone through most of the keys there, and they all sound good. So that's nice, but they don't, the gaps in between the notes are not the same. So if I play all of the notes one by one, we might hear, perhaps if you've got really good ears, you might hear that the gaps between them are not equal. Right, now one thing I want to demonstrate for you is the difference between an instrument where we have pure fifths and the modern equal temperament. Now I'm going to play a little bit from the very first piece in the well-tempered clavier, which might be familiar to you, I don't know. But I'm going to play it, first of all, on the clavichord using that just intonation. So where all of the fifths are, at least in C major, perfectly in tune. Okay, there was a little bit there, that bit, which didn't quite sound right to me. So that's heavily compromised tuning system, that one, on the keyboard. So let's go to Bach's well-tempered version. We'll try the same thing again. So that sounds great, sounds perfectly in tune there. What if I play the whole thing up a semitone? How will that work? It should work fine because he's got an instrument which works well in every key. So if I tune the whole thing up to be in C sharp major, it would sound very strange on one of those other instruments, but should sound quite good here. So it sounds fine. Now I'm going to play the same thing again, this time using equal temperament. So this is what we have today. Now I think immediately on the very first hearing of this, you might just catch how out of tune equal temperament actually is, but your ear will really quickly adjust to it. So here we go. So by the end of listening to that, that would have sounded fine, but maybe at the beginning of that, you might have just got an idea of how out of tune equal temperament actually is. So this fifth and this third, can you really hear that third? That's equal temperament and that's not in tune, and Bach would not have used equal temperament that we use today on all our instruments. He would not have wanted to use that because that out of tune third would have sounded offensive to him. So he came up with his own tuning system in which the third would have sounded something like this. So much more acceptable to him than what we accept today as equal temperament. Right, we've drifted quite far from the subject of this, the well-tempered clavier, but that's the whole well-tempered part of it, and it's part of the title, so pretty important. So let's now look at the music itself. What's in it? Well, we've heard a little bit of the very first prelude in it, but there are 24 pairs of preludes and fugues in each key. Now, the keys it goes through are C, so C major and C minor, C sharp, major and minor, D major, D minor, E flat major, E flat minor. Now, the fugue of the E flat one is actually in D sharp minor, so on a keyboard instrument, the key for E flat is the same as the key for D sharp. We call them enharmonic equivalents in our musical sort of language. But there we go. That's why he's got E flat minor for the prelude and D sharp minor for the fugue of that prelude and fugue pair. So onward, we've got E major, E minor, F major, F minor, F sharp major, F sharp minor, G, A flat, G sharp, A, B flat, and B. So it ends, the very last pair are in B minor. Preludes and fugues. What are preludes and fugues? So a prelude, it's quite a free piece of music. Across the book one, A World Tempo Clavier, it covers really quite a wide range of styles which were current at Bach's time, or over this 10-year period that he's writing this music. Sometimes they make reference to quite old styles as well. So I can imagine that, given it was something he worked on over a long period of time, perhaps he heard a piece of music one day that was new to him, and if it appealed to him somehow, maybe he'd try and write a prelude in that style. Or perhaps something was going on in his life on that moment and that day, and he made a connection with a particular style of music and a particular kind of character, particular key perhaps, and then he decided to write a prelude in that sort of style. I think they're quite characterful pieces. Each piece is like a different character, like a different scene perhaps. I think it's like scrolling through the photos on Bach's phone. Can you imagine that? If Bach took photos of everything that's going on in his life, he had them on his phone, and you were able to scroll through them, or his Instagram feed, something like that, but in the form of music. That's what I think these are like, these preludes and fugues. So fugue then, what is a fugue? It comes from a Latin word, fuga, and that's related to a verb fugere, to flee, to run away, and fugare, to chase. So it's quite interesting that those two words in Latin, to run away and to chase, are very closely related. You might have heard of a canon, but a fugue is a canon. Okay, have you heard of a canon? I don't know. But a canon is where you start with a tune and you quite quickly follow with the same tune while the first tune is still going on, also known as a round. I'm sure you may have sung at school London's Burning as a round, where you start, one person starts London's Burning, then the next person is able to join in London's Burning, while the first person is going fire, 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 fire. Okay, so that's a round. A canon works in a very similar way. A fugue is a bit like that, but it's got a few more conventions around it. It's got a few more rules, shall we say, around how you build a fugue. It's been around as an idea for a long time before Bach's time, and it's evolved between probably 1400, when it first started to emerge, to 1700. By the time you get to 1700, when Bach is, going from becoming a boy to becoming a man, around about 1700, it's quite a standardized sort of form, the fugue form. And that's due to various theory books, which were becoming quite widely distributed, and one of those theory books Bach would have learnt from. So by the contrast with preludes, which I think in preludes Bach's using his heart perhaps, in the fugues he's using his head. And there's a bit of heart in the head pieces and a bit of head in the heart pieces, but I think you can perhaps think of them a bit like that. So prelude is the heart and the fugue is his head. Now the fugues are deeply intellectual kind of exercises, and yet also, and despite that, they're laden with character and style as well. But they are a stricter form, and there are some incredible tricks or feats, perhaps trick is too trivial a word, but stunts, I suppose, of the counterpoint and the rules around counterpoint that Bach is able to put into these fugues. They're quite brilliant once you start to unravel them. The fugues, they're very elaborate in structure. It's a bit like, how can I explain what they're like? It's a bit like looking at a clockwork mechanism made of wood. So each piece of that clockwork mechanism is hand-carved, selected from exactly the right kind of wood, shaped perfectly and working perfectly in relation to every other piece of wood in that clockwork mechanism. So you can look deeply at the clockwork, all those different types of wood perfectly made, and you can admire the craftsmanship of each piece. You can admire the engineering of how they are all working together. And then you can step back and look at the whole clock, and you can appreciate that as sort of a self-contained work of art. So all of those different levels, different ways of looking at things, I think fugues work in a very similar way. You can look at the intricate mechanisms and you can step back and see the work of art. So from a composer's perspective, from my perspective perhaps, it's one thing to try and, let's say, complete a kind of crossword or Sudoku puzzle in counterpoint. Even a very hard one, you get the sort of sense of achievement there, and that's impressive in a kind of a way. But to do that and then construct a lengthy piece of music which sets and solves intriguing puzzles, but also it tells a story, takes you on a journey. Sometimes that story is funny, sometimes that's sad, everything in between, to tell you something new and fresh in each one of these fugues, to somehow capture the character of each key. Well, that's why these are masterpieces of the fugue genre. So I mentioned a few times the character of the different keys. Now, this is a thing that quite a few composers have thought about, and I've been particularly obsessed about, is if you are tuning keys so the gaps between each of the notes in the keys are different, then they will have different characters, I suppose. They will sound different. They won't just sound like a higher or a lower version of another key. They will actually be fundamentally different. And I think this is something you find in, particularly in keyboard music, certainly I think in Bach's music and later. As pieces are written in different keys, they take on some kind of character from that key. It's a hard thing to really express and understand, but as you listen to more and more pieces of music and you know what key they're in, perhaps you'll start to build connections between what character a key has, as well as what it sounds like. So these are pairs of preludes and fugues. So do they relate to each other, perhaps? The free prelude and the stricter fugue. Now, in each of these pairs, quite often it's pretty hard to absolutely put your finger on how they're related, why they are a pair, beyond the obvious fact that they're in the same key. And sometimes, quite rarely in fact, there's actually a shared fragment. There's a bit of the prelude which appears in the fugue. That's quite rare, and that would provide a clear link. But usually there isn't that kind of obvious link. And yet, somehow, each pair works as a pair. They fit together and they make sense heard together. Is that Bach capturing the essence of the character of each key? Because that's the shared aspect. I don't know. You'll have a listen to it and you'll find out. So, before you go and listen to it, I'm going to give you a few highlights of each of some of the pieces within it. So the C major one, we heard a little bit of that earlier. It's a bit like a lute strumming, picking out the different strings perhaps. There's no obvious tune to it, but once you start to listen deeply to it, perhaps a tune emerges. It also sounds like it's asking for a missing singer to join in with the music. In fact, this obsessed many composers ever since, and one, called Gounod, a French composer, in 1859, he added a part for sopranos singing the words Ave Maria. Now that's famous now. It's used in weddings, it's used in funerals and other events, and that's built upon Bach's first prelude, the C major one, in this book one of World Tempo Clavier. So then the C minor pair. The prelude, again, there's no obvious tune to it, but perhaps again one starts to emerge as you start to listen to it. You start to get into the zone of the music. This particular prelude, the C minor prelude, was used in a French animated film called Belleville Rendezvous to accompany some racing cyclists who are training. And just this scene I thought was very, very funny. It was a very funny film. And they used this Bach C minor prelude in that one. And I always get that image in my head with this music. So then C sharp major, the next pair. Now this, C sharp major, is a bit of a strange key. Each key has a key signature. It tells you how many sharps are in the key or how many flats are in the key. So in the case of C sharp major, every note in it is sharpened. So it has 7 sharps in the key signature. Now when you're reading that as a musician, that becomes confusing very quickly. It gets quite hard to play. So this particular one, the C sharp major prelude and fugue, they're quite hard for musicians to read. Now, I once heard a story that Bach, who was quite a mischievous person, had someone that kept coming around to his house who, every time he came round, had a look to see what Bach was working on, had a look what was on Bach's music stand, and would have a go at playing some of it on Bach's keyboard. And that irritated Bach a bit. So one day, he'd written this C sharp major prelude and fugue and left it out on the keyboard. So this visitor tried to play it and just couldn't play it. It was so confused, kept making mistakes. And so that was Bach would have thought this was hilarious. I don't know if that's true. And I've tried to find the origin of this story on the internet and I can't, but I didn't dream it. So I don't know. Maybe you know what it is. Maybe you can let me know if that story is true or not. I like to think it is. So then C sharp minor. Now the fugue in the C sharp minor one is one of the longest in the whole book. Normally a fugue has one theme, and that theme is then shared between the different voices. But this one, it actually has 3 different themes, and the second and third appear midway through the piece, which is quite unusual. It's in 5 voices, which the performer, and there's only one performer, has to try and bring out with only 2 hands. Now the main subject of this one, this fugue in C sharp minor, it sounds like this. And that's it. That's all the theme is, just those 4 notes before the next voice comes in. There's something strange about this one. I'll play it again. So it starts on that note, ends on that note, and in between we have notes that are either side of that. Then down, then up, and back inside again. Now that type of arrangement of notes is sort of commonly thought about as a cross motif, because the inner tones sort of form one axis of the cross and the outer tones form the other axis of a cross. And quite often it's thought that it's making reference to the cross of Christ in music. You could say that, but Bach never writes anywhere on the piece of music, this is exactly what that depicts. And so a lot of people have read that into it. Perhaps it's plausible, perhaps it's not, but nonetheless, a lot of people have read that into it. In this piece of music, said it's got 5 voices. It's almost impossible, I think, to try and hear all 5 voices independently. It's kind of a bit like being in a room with 5 people talking across each other, all saying very interesting things, and you have to sort of tune into one at a time to try and follow the discussion. And it's a bit like that with this. So every time you listen to it and you try to follow a different voice, you'll hear something new and something different. Now this fugue, this C-sharp minor fugue alone, there's so much to say about it. It could cover a whole book, let alone a podcast, so I won't dwell on it too much. But I encourage you to search and read further about it if it grabs you. One thing though, about this cross motif, it's a very sad, almost pained piece. And so it is easy to start to hear the music through a kind of Christian perspective, to see it as a depiction of the crucifixion perhaps. And we do know that Bach was deeply religious, so it's very tempting to think that. On the other hand, there's nothing obvious to suggest a direct connection. No, he didn't write some handy notes. He didn't make a nice handy little podcast for us. There's no picture. He hasn't drawn a picture of Jesus on a cross in there. That we have to differentiate between what we hear in a piece of music and what is actually there. What other possibilities might exist? And you might read about, if you go and look up this piece, you might read about some mystical, some numerological reasons why Bach does certain things, does this thing a certain number of times, that thing a certain number of times, or some kind of hidden messages in there. Now, Bach very clearly played all kinds of interesting, clever games inside the music. For example, something which is the same forwards and backwards, something which is turned upside down. And we know that he did add up a number based on converting the letters of his names into numbers and adding them all together. But the problem with that line of thinking, of starting to think there are hidden messages encoded in the music, the problem with that is that it leads to sort of, I don't know, conspiracy theories, quackery. If you want to find something, you'll find evidence of it, but it's pure speculation. It's very entertaining speculation, perhaps, and you'll find lots of web pages telling you all about hidden secret messages inside Bach's music, particularly this fugue, which somehow seems to grab the imagination of someone that wants to look for hidden messages. But nowhere did Bach write a handy guide to some kind of mystical secret language. So it's speculation. But, you know, the internet, it loves these sorts of conspiracies, so you'll find lots of them out there. Right, back to the music. D major. So the D major fugue it's a fun one. I've heard that the subject is sort of likened to a grand flourishing greeting, like taking a big flamboyant hat off in some kind of very grand way. This flourish is very useful when you're listening to the fugue because it's so noticeable. So if you're having a hard time following the different voices in the fugues, and sometimes it really isn't very easy, here is one where it's very obvious when each iteration of the theme is appearing because you've got that big flourish. So then D minor. Now the prelude of the D minor, I find it really quite fun. It's like a discussion between 2 voices, one low voice and one high voice. And the high voice has a lot more to say than the low voice. I can't help but think of this as maybe it's like a blundering man with a low voice explaining himself to his wife, who's perhaps has a lot to say about whatever the subject is. But at the end, they agree happily ever after. Now, the fugue, on the other hand, feels much more sad and reflective. This time it's in 3 voices, not 2. I wonder why. What will you make of it? Have a think about what that might mean to you. E flat major. The E flat major is unusual because the prelude, after a lovely introduction that seems to ask a repeated question, after that, the E flat major prelude is a fugue. That's unusual. But then the actual fugue follows, and that seems really quite cheerful to me. Perhaps it's the answer to the question that was being posed in the prelude. Maybe that's how they work as a pair this time. You could think of the piece as perhaps self-reflection. Perhaps Bach is thinking, what could I have done differently when that happened? What could I have different? I could have done this, could have done that or this, but I did that. It turned out to be all right in the end. It's that kind of piece of music, I think. So then E flat minor. This is a very unusual key. Not many pieces of music in E flat minor, even today, but especially in Bach's time. The prelude almost doesn't sound like a keyboard piece. I think it's much more like perhaps someone playing a lute with a voice singing above it. Something quite operatic, something quite dramatic, stately, somber, implying maybe some kind of dramatic ritual. I don't know. It's very highly ornamented. So you'll hear lots of different approaches to this because the ornaments that you could add that are written as little symbols in the music, you've got lots of different ways to interpret them. And so you'll hear lots of different ways of performing this from different performers. The fugue in the E flat minor pair, it seems quite a lot more disconnected from the prelude than the other pairs in the book. And maybe for a start, that's because, as I mentioned before, it's notated in D sharp minor rather than E flat minor. So I wonder to myself, perhaps this pair, were they written quite far apart in time and then brought together for the collection? I don't know. E major. So E major, this one, it's a very sweet, very gentle piece. Reminds me perhaps of the countryside on a spring day or a lovely summer's day. It was originally written as a standalone piece for his 10-year-old son Wilhelm without a fugue, and so the fugue was added later. But the fugue in this pair that we have now, it pairs very well. It's also short, like the fugue, very cheerful, gentle, apparently simple, but in an elegant, unencumbered way. I wonder if perhaps he's remembering young Wilhelm running around in the fields and young Wilhelm trying to practice the prelude. I don't know, something like that. E minor then. So if E major, the E major prelude and fugue was a lovely sunny day, I think this E minor pair is a rainy day. It's an impressive, dark, rainy day where the rain doesn't stop. It's just incessant, and perhaps Bach is looking out of the window, remembering something fondly, perhaps also regretfully, perhaps sadly. But then there's quite a wild ending to the piece. A storm, perhaps that happens, and that leads into the fugue, which is really definitely wild, almost crazed. So is this a storm outside, or is it a storm in Bach's mind? Has he been temporarily driven mad by remembering this thing, or by someone? F major prelude and fugue. This feels more like a comfortable, familiar kind of picture that Bach is painting, but lots of these little ticklish trills that you'll hear in it. So quite often it'll sound something like this. Something like that. Those are called trills, and there are lots of them in the prelude, and they come back in the fugue as well. So you'll hear those. They become kind of obsessive in the music. The most noticeable aspect of the piece, I think, and maybe it's a bit like, maybe it's a bit like when you're about to sneeze, and yet the sneeze doesn't quite come, and then it goes away all by itself. I don't know. And the trill is there in the fugue as well, so it's a bit of a feature of this pair. F minor, total contrast from the F major. The F minor pair, they're very dark, very oppressive. Every momentary shaft of light that comes in seems almost immediately snuffed out. I wonder what was happening in Bach's life when he wrote this. Something really dark. The subject of the fugue is incredibly kind of reluctant, as if he's dragging himself somewhere that he just doesn't want to go to, or something he doesn't want to have to do. It's just too much for him to bear. Maybe it's a funeral of someone that he loves that he's got to go to. Maybe it's one of his children that didn't make it to adulthood. It just seems deeply sorrowful, this F minor pair. So then we get to F sharp major, another great change in character and in tone. And this seems very carefree to me, this one. Whatever was bothering Bach in that F minor mood, it isn't here at all in the F sharp major mood. They're totally different. Not just in the music, but I'm sure the key seems to support this too. Somehow about the character of the key. It just seems to lift you. But then we get to F sharp minor. It's perhaps not sad, so much sad to this one as melancholic. The subject of the fugue is very minimal, as if you didn't have many words to express what needed to be said here, and yet it's filled with yearning. As if he didn't quite have the words, so he tried to put it into music. Something like that. G major. The G major prelude is very short, very exuberant, very lively indeed, but the fugue which follows is much longer, equally full of fun, unexpected little spikes, little jumps. Perhaps you can imagine, I don't know, some kittens running around and chasing each other, full of energy, constantly inquisitive, excited, occasionally jumping straight up into the air in the way that kittens can do. I don't know if Bach had kittens running around in his house, but he would certainly have seen that once, at least for sure, I imagine. Perhaps he's trying to capture that in music. Who knows? Now, we're a bit more than halfway through the piece. I won't describe all the others and what I think about them because I want you to listen to them. I want you to think about them for yourself. What do you think you see in each one? This is just scrolling through Bach's musical photo library on his phone, as I like to think about it. But let's consider the very last one in B minor, because in a book full of special music, this one really stands out. So in the prelude, we have two voices intertwining over a bass line. Now, this general principle of two voices and a bass line, it was commonly used in music for two instruments and a bass, for example, two violins and a cello with harpsichord. It's quite a common sort of lineup at the time, and that was called a trio sonata. And so he's doing this kind of trio sonata in the prelude, but it just seems unbearably sad. It seems apparently simple, yet hinting at something far more complex beneath the surface. Then we have the fugue, the last piece in the whole of this book. Now, this theme of this fugue in B minor, particularly interesting and wonderful. So I'll have a go at playing a bit of it for you. Okay, so that's the tune. Quite an interesting theme, that, but suggests sadness, some kind of painful memory, sighing. Now these sighs, these musical sighs, that was quite a conventional way of depicting sighing, sobbing in music. But there's also something strange about the notes, and this isn't one of these conspiracy theories. This is as clear as the notes on the page. If you play every single one of these notes together, you'll find he's playing every single note of the chromatic scale. So all of the notes, are present in this one theme. So what a perfect way to end this collection that goes chromatically through every single key, than to devise a theme that itself uses every single note. And then to construct this elaborate fugue, the longest in the book by far, and really the most intricate. It certainly is respected as one of the most brilliant of fugues written by Bach, who was himself considered an absolute master of the art of the fugue. But it's much more than a technical masterpiece. I think it takes the listener on a journey in itself through lots of different emotions, lots of different visions, as if it's in some way a summary of all the emotions and memories of all of the rest of the piece, but not in combination, but in a kind of overall reflection of everything that's happened to him in this time that he's been writing this music. Now, listening to this fugue, it's hard, I think, not to imagine that it's describing an entire lifetime's worth of memories, of sorrow, of complications, and joy, and yet this, at the very latest it can be, in 1722, Bach is as yet only 37, has not yet gone to Leipzig, has not yet lived much of his remarkable life, but he doesn't know that. He doesn't know what's to come. What's happening to Bach in 1720, 1721, at the time that he's finishing this book, Well-Tempered Clavier? His first love, Maria Barbara, has suddenly died. They had 7 children, but 3 of them died. His eldest children are still only children. Wilhelm is perhaps 10. Katharina is fast growing up. She's 14 or 15. Does Bach feel that somehow he has a complete life behind him at this point? Is this a sad ending? Is he sort of saying, is that it? It doesn't strike me as an optimistic ending to this book. It doesn't sound like it's written by a young man who's just met a new love, Anna Magdalena, looking forward to a new life in a new big city, Leipzig, with a new job. Doesn't sound like that at all. I think this sounds like it was finished much more, before he's met Anna Magdalena, and while he's still dwelling on Maria Barbara and her death and his children that he has there. There's a dark side, a dark introspective side to Bach that I think we can all find in ourselves. It's a complex, dark side, complicated feelings about our lives, regrets, melancholy, as well as memories of happiness, all combined. And I think we really see that in this music of Bach. Now, however we might choose to interpret this final fugue in B minor and the whole book, well, that's up to each of us. It's extraordinarily rich in music, just this one book, these 48 pieces of Bach's 900 or more pieces, some of which are monumental in size, but we have this one wonderful book. Now, I do recommend listening to it, of course. How might you do that? There are many, many recordings to pick from, and I would recommend trying lots of them. In particular, try and listen to the same music played on different instruments by different performers, and listen to which aspects the performer is trying to bring to the front, trying to tell you about. As with all music, the best way to hear it is live and in person, but in the case of the World Tempo Clavier, you will rarely get the chance to hear all of them together in one go, and I think that would probably almost be too much to take, but you'll quite likely hear a pair from the book here and there in different concerts alongside other music. There's something about the reflective, the personal nature of the World Tempo Clavier that means listening to recordings gives you something, I think, that maybe you can't get in a live performance in a room with other people. In particular, therefore, I would pick the recording by Glenn Gould. Now, these recordings, they were extremely popular in the 1960s. His recordings of the World Tempo Clavier Book 1, they were released in 3 records in 1963, 64 and 65, but you can find them all together on streaming platforms like Spotify. Now, these recordings, they're unusual even among the wide variety of recordings of this music. Glenn Gould, he was a brilliant pianist. He came to despise the institution of the public concert. He even went so far as to call public concerts a force of evil. He thought they were a form of competition. He didn't like applause, so he stopped performing in public and he turned to the recording studio instead. He would very carefully bring to life in the recording studio exactly the perspective, the interpretation that he wanted, without having to let the unexpected and spontaneous things that can happen in a concert get in the way. So you might say that those things are exactly what make live concerts especially exciting, but that would be, I think, to miss the point of what Glenn Gould wanted to achieve. So in his recordings of Bach, he recorded lots of music of Bach, but in particular the World Tempo Clavier, we get an exceptionally carefully crafted performance, an interpretation that was specifically designed to be engaged with as a recording, not as a live performance. So Glenn Gould and his ideas are interwoven with Bach's musical ideas and Bach's memories. And very unusually, in those recordings, we can hear the performer himself. You'll often catch Glenn Gould humming along to the music, for example. I think it adds to the overall experience. I really like it. His interpretations are often quite different to the standard ways of approaching the music as well. You only need to listen to what he does with that very first prelude in C major and compare it to pretty much every other recording and performance. I won't spoil it for you. You'll have to go and listen to it for yourself to find out what I mean. So go and find Glenn Gould's recordings of the World Tempo Clavier. Maybe pick a major and minor pair of pairs, a different set each day, and listen to them, maybe as a morning reflection with a cup of coffee if you like, with your eyes closed. Let Glenn Gould take you on a journey. Try to hear the individual voices in the music, particularly in the fugues, and how they talk to each other, how the theme bounces back and forth. But even more, try to see what memories and pictures the music conjures up for you, in the same way that perhaps it did for Bach. And yes, do it more than once. Do it many times over. You'll get so much more from the music each time you listen to it. One last idea for listening to it, an alternative to Glenn Gould. It's quite hard to find, I think, but if you can, find the arrangement made by Sir Peter Maxwell Davies, the British composer, of the C-sharp major Prelude and Fugue. He created an arrangement of that Prelude and Fugue for his group, his band, who are called the Fires of London. Now, I just think that arrangement is one of the happiest, most joyful things I've ever heard in music. Quite hard to find, but if you can, I think it's well worth it. Right, so that's all for now. I'm going to finish here. You go and listen to the World Tempo Clavier. I'll go and work on the next episode of Tim the Composer's podcast. Bye for now.